Imagine your brain as a complex biochemical laboratory where thousands of reactions occur every second, determining your mood, motivation, and sense of happiness. At the center of this laboratory are four key substances: dopamine, responsible for pleasure and the anticipation of reward; serotonin, regulating mood and a sense of satisfaction; oxytocin, the hormone of attachment and trust; and endorphins, natural pain relievers and sources of euphoria. This delicate chemistry of happiness has been forming for millions of years, but in the last 2 decades, something unprecedented has happened. Our brain has plunged into digital reality. Every notification, like, and message triggers a cascade of biochemical reactions, altering the work of neural networks. We have become the first generation whose brains are subjected to such intense digital stimulation daily, and science is only just beginning to understand how this transforms our biochemistry of happiness and what it means for our future. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter known as the molecule of motivation and anticipation. It is a biochemical mechanism that drives us to strive for goals, overcome difficulties, and experience pleasure from achievements. For millions of years, this tiny molecule helped our ancestors hunt, gather food, and survive. But what happens when this ancient reward system encounters modern technology? Social media and app developers have turned dopamine stimulation into a precise science. Each notification, like, and message is a microdose of pleasure, carefully calibrated for maximum effect. Endless scrolling through the newsfeed is not accidental, but a well-thought-out mechanism that creates a constant anticipation of the next reward. The most interesting thing is that dopamine is released not so much when a reward is received, but when it is anticipated. The sound of an incoming message causes a greater dopamine surge than the content of the message itself. This is why we check our phones so often. The brain craves that moment of anticipation. Digital platforms create a perfect storm of small but frequent rewards, what neuroscientists call variable reinforcement. This is the same principle that slot machines operate on. The unpredictability of the reward makes it especially appealing to our brain. Over time, a vicious cycle forms: anticipation, reward, desire for more. Gradually, the sensitivity threshold to dopamine increases, and more stimulation is required to achieve the same pleasure. This is the biochemical basis of digital addiction, where the ordinary joys of life cease to bring satisfaction. Serotonin is one of the key neurotransmitters of happiness, regulating our mood and overall sense of well-being. When its level is stable, we feel calm, content, and emotionally resilient. The paradox of modernity is that despite unprecedented opportunities for communication, people experience increasing loneliness. We have never been so connected and yet so disconnected at the same time. Digital technologies have created the illusion of constant social inclusion. Hundreds of friends on social networks, instant access to messages, video calls to any part of the world. However, the biochemistry of our brain tells a different story. For a full production of serotonin, deep social connections, tactile contact, eye-to-eye gaze, synchronization of breathing and heart rate during personal communication are necessary. Virtual interactions do not fully trigger these ancient mechanisms. Text messages do not contain intonations. Emojis do not replace facial expressions. And video calls do not transmit pheromones and micro-expressions. Neurobiologists have found that prolonged virtual communication without a sufficient number of real contacts leads to a gradual decrease in the sensitivity of serotonin receptors. The brain, as if saying to us, "This is not a real social connection. I need something deeper." Hence, the serotonin paradox arises. The more time we spend in digital communication, the stronger the internal feeling of isolation can become, despite the apparent hyperconnectivity. Oxytocin is often called the hormone of hugs, love, and trust. This amazing neuropeptide plays a key role in forming our deepest emotional bonds, from maternal attachment to romantic love. When we hug a loved one, look into the eyes of those we care about, or simply are near those we trust, our brain releases oxytocin, creating a feeling of warmth, security, and belonging. In the digital age, tech companies are desperately trying to recreate this ancient mechanism. High-resolution video calls, virtual gifts, animated reactions. All these are attempts to simulate the conditions under which oxytocin is naturally produced. Social platforms are introducing features that create an illusion of closeness. Personalized greetings, friendship reminders, virtual touches through smartphone vibrations. But can digital imitation trigger the same biochemical processes as real physical contact? Studies show that virtual communication can indeed cause a small release of oxytocin, especially when we see the faces of loved ones on screen. However, this effect is significantly weaker and shorter-lived than during real interaction. The reason lies in the evolutionary mechanisms of oxytocin production, which require complex sensory stimulation. Tactile sensations, smells, synchronized breathing, nonverbal cues, subtle micro-expressions. Digital communication channels simply cannot transmit this entire spectrum of information necessary for a full oxytocin response. In an era when the flow of information never ceases, our brains face an unprecedented load. Continuous notifications, endless news feeds, 24/7 access to global events. All this triggers a cascade of biochemical reactions, central among which is cortisol, the stress hormone. Evolutionarily, cortisol is designed for short-term mobilization of the body in dangerous situations. Heart rate speeds up, blood pressure rises, senses sharpen. But what happens when this system is constantly activated? Our brain does not distinguish between real and digital threats. An alarming news message, a contentious comment, or just the sound of a notification, all of this can cause a cortisol surge, as if a real danger were before us. This mechanism is particularly evident in the phenomenon of FOMO, the fear of missing out. Biochemically, FOMO is continuous anxiety, sustained by elevated cortisol levels, which forces us to constantly check for updates and fear disconnecting from the information flow. The constant multitasking we practice with digital devices also maintains high cortisol levels. Studies show that switching between tasks increases stress hormone production by 20%. Moreover, our brain is not evolutionarily adapted to this mode of operation. It merely simulates multitasking, rapidly switching between foci of attention and expending colossal energetic resources. Particularly alarming is that chronically elevated cortisol disrupts the work of other neurotransmitters of happiness. It suppresses serotonin production, leading to a decrease in mood, blocks dopamine receptors, reducing motivation, and hinders the action of oxytocin, intensifying feelings of isolation. A vicious circle forms. Stress from digital overload worsens our emotional state, and we try to compensate for this by even greater immersion in the digital world. What happens to our brains when they are exposed to continuous digital stimulation for years? This question becomes increasingly relevant as we observe the first signs of long-term changes in neurotransmitter function. Digital fatigue syndrome is not just a trendy term, but a real condition characterized by chronic depletion of the brain's neurochemical systems. Much like an overtrained athlete loses the ability to recover, our brain enters a state of biochemical exhaustion. Constant stimulation of the dopamine system through endless reward cycles leads to an increased sensitivity threshold of receptors. The brain, accustomed to intense dopamine spikes from likes and notifications, gradually loses the ability to find pleasure in ordinary, non-digital joys of life. The neurochemical foundation of addictive behavior forms imperceptibly. First, we reach for our phone out of habit, then out of a need for dopamine stimulation. Research shows an alarming link between digital habits and the rise of depressive disorders. When the serotonin system operates under a constant deficit of deep social connections, and oxytocin mechanisms are deprived of real tactile contact, the brain gradually reconfigures itself into a state of chronic distress. Particularly vulnerable are the developing brains of adolescents, whose neural connections are forming under conditions of digital hyperstimulation. Neuroplasticity, an advantage of the young brain, becomes its Achilles heel. Neural pathways responsible for reward are literally rewired under the influence of digital stimuli. Most alarmingly, these changes occur at the level of gene expression, potentially affecting future generations. Our brain is an amazing mechanism, having fine-tuned its cycles of motivation and reward over millions of years. Imagine an ancient human who, after days of preparation and hours of tracking, procures food. Their brain releases a powerful dopamine surge, a well-deserved reward for sustained effort. But what's happening today? Digital technologies have completely reprogrammed this ancient system. Notifications, likes, in-game achievements, all these create artificial microdoses of pleasure that we receive dozens of times an hour. The brain has literally found itself trapped in a gamified reality where every action is designed to elicit a dopamine response. Recommendation algorithms study our preferences and offer content most likely to trigger a neurochemical reaction. This creates a positive feedback loop where we spend more and more time searching for the next digital reward. The most alarming consequence of this process is a fundamental change in our attitude towards achievements. When the brain gets used to instant gratification, long-term projects requiring patience and effort become unattractive. Creative processes, deep learning, building relationships, everything that requires delayed gratification loses out in the competition for our attention. The ability for sustained concentration shrinks, and the craving for immediate stimulation grows. We are observing a generation that struggles with tasks that don't offer instant feedback. However, understanding these mechanisms gives us the opportunity to regain control over our own motivational systems. The blue light from screens, an inseparable companion of our lives, profoundly impacts the biochemistry of sleep, a process critically important for our emotional well-being. When the sun sets, the pineal gland in our brain should begin producing melatonin, a hormone regulating sleep-wake cycles. However, the blue light from smartphones, tablets, and computers has a wavelength almost identical to daylight, tricking our brain into thinking it's still daytime. This leads to a suppression of melatonin production by 40 to 70%. The result? Disrupted circadian rhythms, difficulty falling asleep, and fragmented sleep. The neurochemical consequences of this cascade extend far beyond a single sleepless night. A lack of quality sleep directly affects the production of serotonin, a neurotransmitter regulating our mood. Studies show that even one night of poor sleep reduces the sensitivity of serotonin receptors, making us more prone to irritability and mood swings. The dopamine system also suffers. Sleep deprivation reduces the activity of dopamine receptors in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and self-control. This explains why, after a sleepless night, we are more prone to impulsive decisions, and excessive use of digital devices. The brain seeks quick dopamine compensation. Particularly alarming is the fact that many use smartphones as the last thing they see before bed, and the first thing they pick up in the morning, creating a continuous cycle of disrupted sleep biochemistry and emotional imbalance. In a world where technology often poses a problem for our neurochemical balance, technology itself becomes a paradoxical solution. We are creating digital tools to combat digital addiction, a kind of technological antidote. Meditation apps are now used by millions of people striving to restore serotonin balance and reduce cortisol levels. Neurobiological studies confirm regular mindfulness practice through digital platforms indeed increases the density of gray matter in brain regions responsible for emotional regulation. Sleep trackers analyze our rest cycles and phases, helping to optimize melatonin production and restore circadian rhythms. They not only collect data, but also offer personalized recommendations based on our unique sleep profile. Screen time regulation programs become our digital bodyguards, protecting us from excessive dopamine stimulation. They block notifications, limit app access, and remind us to take breaks. How effective is using technology to combat technology? Research shows mixed results. On the one hand, many apps genuinely help users form healthier digital habits. On the other hand, there's a risk of forming a new addiction, where we become tethered to meditation apps or wellness trackers. The gold standard of digital well-being is technology that gradually makes itself unnecessary, teaching users to self-regulate their neurochemical balance without constant external support. Imagine taking a break, turning off all devices, silence. Awkward at first, almost frightening, but gradually soothing. This isn't just rest, it's a reboot of your neurochemistry. Digital detox is becoming not just a fashionable trend, but a necessary practice for restoring biochemical balance in an era of information overload. University of California studies show astonishing results. After just 72 hours without a smartphone, cortisol levels decrease by 30%, and dopamine receptor sensitivity begins to recover. Our brain, freed from endless stimulation, returns to its natural rhythms. But how to integrate digital detox into life without going to the mountains? Start with micro-practices. 10-minute periods without a phone several times a day. Create gadget-free zones. The bedroom, the dining table, places for communicating with loved ones. Practice digital twilight. 2 hours before bed, switch to a screen-free mode, allowing melatonin to naturally increase. A weekly digital Sabbath. A day of complete device abstinence gives your nervous system deep recovery. The practice of conscious return is especially effective. After detox, carefully monitor your emotions during the first contact with devices. This moment of mindfulness helps break automatic cycles of addiction. Gradually, you will notice how your perception of the world changes. Colors become brighter, conversations deeper, and simple joys richer. This is not an illusion. This is your brain restoring its natural sensitivity to serotonin and dopamine, returning to the biochemical balance for which it was created by evolution. In a world of digital overload, our bodies hold ancient wisdom that we often forget. Physical activity is not just a way to stay in shape, but a powerful biochemical tool, capable of counteracting the negative effects of digital addiction. When we move, a real chemical revolution is triggered in our bodies. Just 30 minutes of intense exercise increases the production of endorphins, natural opiates that create a state of euphoria known as runner's high. This natural mood boost can last for hours, significantly reducing the craving for digital stimulation. Regular physical exercise normalizes dopamine receptors, lowering their sensitivity threshold, which is overstimulated by digital technologies. The brain gradually regains the ability to derive pleasure from natural sources of reward. Outdoor exercises are especially effective. Contact with nature enhances serotonin production, creating a natural antidepressant effect. Sunlight, hitting the skin and retina, triggers a cascade of reactions that regulate circadian rhythms and normalize melatonin production. Even a short 20-minute walk in the park reduces cortisol levels by 12%. Group workouts add oxytocin to this cocktail, restoring the ability to form real social connections. Synchronizing movements with other people creates a sense of unity, unavailable in the digital space. Most surprisingly, physical activity changes the expression of genes associated with neuroplasticity, literally reprogramming the brain for healthier patterns of responding to stress and reward. Movement becomes not just a healthy habit, but a natural antidote to digital overload. We stand on the threshold of a new era of digital well-being. Having conducted a deep analysis of technology's influence on brain neurochemistry, we can now formulate the key principles of a balanced digital life. The first and most important is mindfulness. Understanding the mechanisms by which digital technologies affect our brain allows us to transform unconscious consumption into conscious choice. When we know that every notification is a microdose of dopamine, we can decide whether we need this stimulation right now. The second principle is digital ecology. Technologies should complement our lives, not consume them. Creating personal rules for digital consumption, from gadget-free zones to regular digital detoxes, becomes not a whim, but a necessity for maintaining healthy neurochemistry. The future of technology is seen in its ethical development, taking into account the biochemical characteristics of the brain. Apps are already being developed that do not exploit dopamine cycles, but help form healthy habits. Interfaces that reduce cognitive load, devices that adapt to circadian rhythms, algorithms that prioritize content quality over its ability to hold attention. All these are the first steps towards technologies that respect our neurochemistry. Education in digital well-being must begin at an early age. Children who understand the principles of how their brain works will be able to form healthy relationships with technology. Schools of the future will teach not only how to use digital tools, but also how to maintain neurochemical balance in the digital world. Ultimately, harmonious coexistence with technology is possible. We can use the achievements of the digital era without sacrificing the biochemistry of happiness. The key to this is not the rejection of technology, but its integration into life in ways that support, rather than undermine, the natural mechanisms of joy, motivation, and connection that evolution has honed for millions of years.